Hello and welcome to another episode of Momento Malum today. After the discovery of the New World, many crops were introduced to Europe, the tomato being just one. In 1989, Sergio Torrelza, an expert in medieval herbals, examined a well-preserved tomato specimen that was found in a 16th century book called the Tinde Herbarium. He found that this document has origins in Italy between 1542 and 1544. At the time, these findings meant that this document, if correctly dated, was the oldest existing herbarium containing tomatoes. The document would be analyzed by a great many researchers to learn about the early tomato breeding efforts of Europeans during the 16th century. Several other works on the various naturalists who interacted with tomatoes and the genetic data regarding the domestication of the tomato would be analyzed. This analysis would happen by Dr. Andel, who had created a timeline of the history of the 16th century tomato cultivars and where they came from, and here are the results. The first known mention of the tomato was in 1544 with the Italian physician and botanist Pietro Andrea Maffoli. He lived between 1501 and 1578. He was the first person to mention tomatoes in Europe. In the first edition of his comment on the famous herbal De Materia Medica, he wrote his first mention of the tomato. Using his words, it was discovered that the tomato was introduced multiple times to Europe over a long period of time. The first tomato he saw was acquired by his teacher, Luca Ghini. He had obtained his seeds either from the Venetian patrician and naturalist Pietro Antonio Michele, or another one of Mr. Ghini's students, Luigi Squalmaro. Mr. Ghini taught medical botany in Pisa from 1544 to 1555, where he founded the University Botanical Garden, under the support of the Grand Duke of Tuscany, Mr. Cosmino. Mr. Cosmino attempted to import and acclimatize various American plants into Italy. This garden would be further enriched by Mr. Ghini through the introduction of exotic species. He had also taught students to press and dry botanical specimens between paper. Mr. Maffoli would not travel, but would instead compile dried specimens into his archives. Another one of Mr. Ghini's disciples was Ulysses Androvandi, who became famous for his 16-volume herbarium with 4,000 specimens kept at the Botanical Garden in Bologna. Tomato specimens preserved in the first volume. Work has been done to trace the origin of Mr. Aldrovandi's specimens, but unfortunately for the researchers, it could not be traced, and the information has not survived. Another individual is Mr. Petrolini, whose birth and death dates remains unknown. Also attended classes by Mr. Ghini and graduated in Bologna in 1551. Two of his dried tomato specimens have survived within two of his many books, written in 1553. The earliest confirmed image of the tomato was an uncolored woodcut illustration that was published in 1553 in a Latin herbal written by the Flemish doctor and botanist Rembert Doodens. A year later, he published the colored version of the same woodcut. Dr. Doodens studied at several universities and traveled to France, Germany, and Italy from 1535 to 1546. In 1548, he settled in what is now known as Belgium, a hotspot for 16th century naturalists and collectors. In a later edition of his herbal, he wrote an acknowledgement listing the people who supplied him with plants. One of them was Jean de Brachian, who had a beautiful garden with many exotic species. Mr. Aldrovandi's manuscripts kept at the University of Bologna. There are several lists of seeds sent to Mr. de Brachian, tomatoes being amongst them. If you want to donate to my channel, the links are below. If you want to buy my book, you can also find that link in the description box below. In 1548, the Grand Duke Cosmino I was presented with some tomatoes from his Florentine estate. A letter from 1548 mentions that the materials arrived safely to his home. The various cultivar names of the tomatoes indicate that even during this time, the cultivars came in different colors, ranging from red to gold to brown to yellow. A list of cultivar descriptions will be seen on the last slide. The woodcut illustrations of the elongated segmented tomatoes by Mr. Camararis and Mr. Mafuli would appear through the commentaries on Dioscorus and continue to be a bestseller after Mr. Mafuli's death. However, the 16th century herbarium specimens and the images of small spherical tomatoes in unpublished manuscripts remain locked up in the royal treasure rooms, as well as libraries and universities. Prior to these documents being rediscovered, the original idea was that the earliest tomatoes introduced to Europe were large and lumpy, a mutation from a smoother, more diminutive Mesoamerican form, and probably the direct ancestor of some modern tomatoes. Since then, it's become clear that a great many different tomatoes were introduced early on into Europe. These represent a great variety in flower, fruit shape, size, and color. The geographical origin of the early tomatoes remained a debated issue. The 16th century literature, specimens, and illustrations do not answer this question, however. Proven origin mentioned by a few contemporary writers was not specific enough to narrow the geographical origin. Knowledge on tomatoes existing in Europe during the 16th century came from plants that were already cultivated in gardens, as is evident from the detailed morphological descriptions on fruit shape and color. These characters were only observable in living plants. The origins of these botanical specimens seem to not have been of great interest to the 16th century scholars. Most of these individuals instead try to trace the tomato back to the writings of the ancient Greek authors, and try to seek them out in ancient Greece. Regarding the herbarium specimens, we only know that the Ralvo tomatoes collected somewhere in northern Italy, and the Bauhin tomatoes were possibly cultivated in its namesake's garden in Basel. Genetic data regarding the origins of the population of 16th century tomatoes would be ultimately based on its neighbors and what little DNA we can get from the original specimens. Based on its information, this lineage is closely related to the cherry tomatoes and wild and feral tomatoes found in Mexico. Unfortunately, this is as far as the researchers could go in terms of determining the origins of these lineages. So for the time being, the origins of the 16th century tomatoes remains at least partially a mystery. But we now know more than we did back then, and that's always a good thing. That about covers everything. Thank you for watching.